Hi guys, Josh here from Rogue Grappling. Today's episode we're going to be interviewing Dan Vanderlans. He's the owner and creator of TechNACITY Fightwear. They've been our biggest supporter so far. They've sponsored us from our first event. We're going to be discussing jiu-jitsu, his brand, mental health, and whatever else comes up. We're here at his family's business, the Honeycomb Health Market, and we're going to drink some coffee and chat about jiu-jitsu. Let's go on inside.
Okay, so here we are in on location Honeycomb Health Market in Truro with our good friend Dan Vanderlans, the one of the original old school faces around the maritime jiu-jitsu scene. It's a pleasure to be able to sit down and chat with you about your journey and your businesses and everything you got your hands in, man. So thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
It's a great day for a drive.
Yes, man. A little bit of snow, but nonetheless, good all around. It's funny when you say old school because technically I came in on the cusp at the end of the original old school maritime Brazilian jiu-jitsu scene. So I think there was certainly at least a 10-year legacy before me, but it was so diverse. And those were the times when the guys would tell me they'd all gather around a TV screen with a VCR cassette and they'd watch poor quality arm bars. There was no YouTube,
Yeah.
There was, if someone had a blue belt, they were regarded as, a real force to be contended with. There wasn't that. Yeah, it was. So the stories were fascinating. It was when you had the original, sort of Gracie challenges where people were actually putting to test my Taekwondo versus your Jiu-Jitsu. So we saw a lot of things inside clubs and inside of makeshift environments that you certainly wouldn't see today. And again, I was fortunate to come up with the Chris Hughes, the Peter Martells, the Jarrett McIntoshes, the Jason McKays, the Matt McGraths. Of course, Jake McKenzie was just a blue belt when we met, and the TJ Grants. There's so many. Forgive me for only mentioning a few offhand because there's so many more that are equal in that group of originators. So it was a really neat time to get in, and the UFC was not the polished product that it is today either. So things were a little more informal, welcoming, maybe intimidating at some times and on some levels as well. But it's really neat to have been there at the end of that cusp, and then to be here where we're sort of at the beginning of a new cusp of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the Maritimes, where it's finally hit its stride. The clubs are packed, the tournaments are packed. We have them on a regular basis. There's most exciting is that there's students from the Maritimes that are going out into the national, international, even world scene and demonstrating that we have something to offer here in the Maritimes.
Holding their own and doing really well.
That's right. And in terms of tournaments, I was around for those beginning tournaments, and they were rough around the edges. They were exciting, and you would see things again that maybe you'd never see, or maybe you shouldn't have been to see. But and then I went through that period where I held my own tournaments at Marmac, and we would have a couple of hundred people hoarded into a basement. And off the record, if the fire marshal had ever known, he would have shut everything down. But you had such support. When there was a tournament, the entire Atlantic Eastern Canada community came together. So if it was in a basement dojo, you had to expect 250 people sometimes, not necessarily competing, but there to see the show. And there was a lot of kinks in the game, and we would look up to the IBJJFs, and they had the television or the camcorders and the screens, which is what Rogue Grappling and Submission Series Pro has done locally. So the jiu-jitsu scene has grown. It's become very polished, very exciting, very much open to a safe experience at any age. Students can come into clubs now, so we're slowly catching up to that hockey lifestyle, so to speak.
Yeah, before it was like the Wild West.
It was the Wild West. Yep. Anything. That was my first tournament. I can remember two big guys wrestling, and my first tournament ever back in 2008. I mean, many notable names today would have not even been graded at the time, but it was a who's who, and I have it on video. We'll watch it sometime.
Yeah, I'd love
but
that,
this
man.
big giant guy, two giant guys were fighting, and they were neither judo guys or BJJ guys, and maybe it was a mistake, but maybe they didn't understand break falls. But 250 pounds went to brace himself, plus the other 250-pound guy on him, and his arm just went wonk the other way, and it was gruesome. And he was in tremendous pain, and those things happen in any tournament, unfortunately. But there was things like that may have, not saying they did, but may have occurred more frequently than they do today. So, it was the Wild West. You said it first.
Like when you're thinking about your personal journey and when you got into jiu-jitsu and you found the art, you found the sport. Like what brought you to it?
Honestly, I credit one of my best friends and Henzo Gracie, Kevin Taylor black belt, Nathan Stever out of Bathurst, New Brunswick, with bringing my attention to the Japanese style of jiu-jitsu. And this was in 2001, 2002. I was on a reckless path then and involved in things I shouldn't have been, so to speak. And I certainly wasn't committed to the workout, but the Japanese jiu-jitsu and the movements he showed me fascinated me. And then he started getting into actual Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and that was that was interesting too, because he was very honest. He would say, Dan, like, all that stuff I showed you and all the wrist locks that would work on me, it was somewhat not ninjutsu, but there was more of that flair. He was like, well, I went down to this club with these guys, Peter Martell and Kevin Taylor, and they whooped me, Dan. So he was willing to let go of that commitment, that loyalty to a 15-year journey in Japanese jiu-jitsu. He was willing to go down to the club and test it. It's the same as the Jason McKays and the Jarrett McIntoshes to some degree. Went and tested their thing, but
takes a healthy ego.
Does it ever?
Be willing to recalibrate.
Yeah, and Nathan came back and said, look, Dan, the Japanese jiu-jitsu is just not working. I bet on the wrong thing. And I'm like, well, this is interesting. And then my sister started dating Chris Hughes, who, so that really piqued my interest, this Brazilian jiu-jitsu thing. And then the UFC was at the pinnacle of that introduction for the Forrest Griffin, Stephan Bonner, their first fight was happening at that time on Spike TV. So there was a real resurgence. My original interest probably happened back when I was 16 or 17. My father and I watching Royce Gracie do things the first UFC 1 and 2 were the most exciting things. I couldn't believe I was watching the real blood sport. That was the movie I watched as a kid that meant something to me. So this was really happening. So then anyhow, my sister ended up dating and marrying my brother-in-law, Chris Hughes, who was fortunate enough to go train with the Gracies in the late 90s. And he and Chuck Sproul, still a local black belt here, brought the Gracies to Truro, Nova Scotia. So people have no idea that the history that occurred right here. I wasn't part of it. I've heard stories directly from those that were at Chuck Sproul, Chris Hughes, Peter Martell, Kevin Taylor, Hoyles, Jason McKay, Jarrett, McIntosh, anyone from that old school. Shane Rice has been. I mean, he was the man, right? Yeah. He was there for a moment before he went directly to Hickson. He went right to the source. He was flying to Columbia, if you know what I mean. He's like, I know where the source is. I'm going to Hickson's, but nonetheless, there was also, forgive me, and there's probably a lot of guys out there that are far more sensitive to their story, and I'm not doing it any justice by kind of throwing it in the mix. That's not what I'm looking to do. I'm looking to pay homage, but each of these names I mentioned and so many more had a really cool lineage, upbringing, experience here in the Maritimes, where some of the most prominent jiu-jitsu players in Brazil have come to clubs like yours in MXT, Mashido Kai. We've flown so many of the world's best in that things have changed. So that's what piques my interest. And then my brother-in-law said, I'm going to open a club here in Truro. I was like, all right, count me in. And I was a skinny fat kid at the time. I tell people I couldn't run from here to 10 feet away to get a bucket of water to put myself out if I was on fire. I was a smoker, and I didn't have the work ethic, the cardio, and yet I quickly realized that, wow, this is cool. Like, my lanky legs can triangle someone, and they can triangle that tough guy with tattoos, and I'm not that tough guy. This is kind of cool. And it was just like, wow, this is fascinating. And
it's like developing a superpower.
Yeah, like it was real. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
My brother-in-law would take us over to the exhibition, and this is no joke. He would put on the Gracie challenges, and I was a white belt. And we would have these tough guys come out of the crowd, and I had to represent our school and the Gracie legacy. And yeah,
that is badass,
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Now there was no striking. There was a young Filipino Muay Thai guy kicked me, but fortunately he wasn't powerful, and I was able to grab the leg and brutishly wrestle him to the ground where I could apply my one or two submissions I knew. Right?
That's awesome.
Half the time you'd get someone to the ground, and then I'd let them throw me on my back so I could triangle them, because that's all I knew. There was no idea of staying on top, and I was a white belt. So that's where TechNACITY came from, which is a brand name that I developed.
Super recognizable for anybody around the Maritimes.
Here in the Maritimes.
Yeah.
Thank you for the love.
Yeah.
Z-Team, baby. TechNACITY.
So, did you come up with the idea for TechNACITY as that early? Like what?
Yeah. Way back then, maybe blue belt, but my probably my favorite and most predominant training partner, Scott Noss, and it was me and Scott Noss, and early on Dylan Lilke, who's the amateur champ out on the West Coast, Pat Carroll, of course. I've said Mickey Marshall, I'm sure, Scott Noss. There's a few others, Cody Glode, of course, who is not with us any longer. But we would sit around, and I was led to believe early on in my BJJ experience that technique is everything. Technique is king. You see that everywhere, right? Technique. I always say, well, if technique is the king, then tenacity is the queen. And we all know what happens when your queen is taken out in chess, right? Let's see how well your king does without your queen. So we would sit around and, we would believe, because we had learned from someone who had learned directly from the Gracies, that we had a technical advantage against these other guys at tournaments. And in some regards, we may have had a technical advantage in some areas, but there was always these guys that would show up who had no formal training, and they were just tenacious. And we quickly realized that, man, like, I know a triangle, and he does it, but he's just tenacious. And I finally get my triangle on him, and yet he just won't tap out, and he tears out of it. So I'm like, it's like technique's not cutting it. These guys got a tenacity. And then it was just a play on words. TechNACITY, skill and will, the science of defiance, the art of existence. It was a name play, but I just said, it's not just technique, it's tenacity. There's some guys out there that will never have the technique to put on a seminar, but they get the job done because they're gamers, they're lifers. There's guys in the club we all know this, that rolled over everybody, and then you bring them to the first tournament and you never see them again after that, Or there's the guy at the club who's like, oh man, he's going to be a disaster. He's up. And he's winning every match. He comes alive. So there's some interweaving there between the two. So that's where that came up with, and then the Z team. I just thought, we got the A team, but man, I'd rather be on the Z team, because this is the representation of someone going to sleep, choking and broken, right? This is bully proof right here, right? We quickly learned. Marcelo Garcia has shown us that if you can jump on that back and go for the choke, you can make something happen. So it favors someone of any size. It certainly favors the thinker, the unique individual. He doesn't have to be the muscle-bound, stereotypical guy you see. Oftentimes he is, and that looks great. But oftentimes he's someone or she. We've got a tremendous female force here in the Maritimes. She is, not necessarily the A. She may be the Z, but she finishes as the A, or he does. So.
That's one of the things we were commenting on before we had the cameras on, is the number of times we've been around anywhere in the East Coast and we're in the Maritimes, and just spotting somebody wearing the TechNACITY shirt or the hoodie or the Z Team hat, and just, it doesn't matter.
East Coast fight style.
Doesn't matter. You'll see it pop
Thank
up.
you, Alex.
Yeah.
Alex McLean gave me the thumbs up to go ahead with the East Coast fight style. But yeah, the love is real. The local community, they buy the hats, they buy the hoodies, and
it's been a mainstay for the Maritime ever since I've been involved. Like I've been seeing people wearing TechNACITY even before I was a one stripe white belt.
Yeah.
You see people wearing it. Like it's such a recognizable brand and image. Like it's really interesting being at a bar or any kind of event and just spotting somebody from across the room, even if you don't get a chance to say hi to them.
Yeah.
There's an instant connection.
There's the instant connection. You nod, like I know what where you got that hat, right?
That's right. It's not the ZZZ or the ZZZ or the Zs. It's the Z team, and that represents the sleeping component of subduing your opponent. So, yeah. So it's been a ride. I've been thankful to train under Peter Martell and Kevin Taylor, Titans, Henzo Gracie Halifax, and Jake McKenzie, Chris Hughes, Jared McIntosh, a tremendous force of competitors and individuals. So it's been a journey.
So
I'm thankful.
You sort of changed, I think you've changed your trajectory for TechNACITY to be more about supportive mental health. Was that always one of the goals, or was that
It
something
was.
that kind of
Yeah,
evolved?
it always was one of the goals. TechNACITY, technique and tenacity. If we go to the Oxford Dictionary, which is the dictionary, technique is defined as an artistic performance or a scientific procedure. What most people don't know is the actual definition of tenacity, which is the fact or quality of continuing to exist. And that's what that defined my jiu-jitsu early on, was that, okay, I'm not always going to win, but as long as I just don't quit out there, because I wanted to desperately. I have severe anxiety, depression. I have bipolar disorder, so there's times where people would see me and say, wow, that guy, he's not experienced depression. Look at him. He's fighting MMA tonight. He's talking boldly or whatnot. But there's other times where, it's scary for me to leave the house, and that's something very hard to explain.
Mm-hmm.
But the factor quality of continuing to exist was both relevant in a jiu-jitsu sense, in which, maybe maybe I'm not going to beat you. Maybe you're going to beat me every time, but I'm going to try my hardest. Whereas there was times early on in my career, I had to contemplate the idea that there's an easy way out. And there was a few times I took the easy way out. And it's not that that's a strike against anyone, but as part of my growth, I said, that's the first thing I want to overcome, is taking the easy way out. And then I realized, damn it, that's all there is. If I put up the best I can, win or lose, that's TechNACITY, which and hence is the art of existence. From a mental health perspective, there's days where I don't thrive. There's days where I'm afraid to leave the house. weeks that might go on where I am depressed, where suicide is a real option to me. I cannot explain the terror, the reality of your own mind turning against you, because it's the only thing I have to use to get back on track, and yet it's
very thing of fighting against
right. So it's a weird thing to explain, and it's a brutally invisible illness in which people could fake if they wanted to, or they could malinger if they wanted to, and so it's complicated. It's lonely. So there's been times where I've not put myself in a pressure or held myself accountable to flourish that day. That's what I want. That's what I want for everyone. But some days just to exist. And I know that sounds a little bleak, but I know that there's people out there that understand me. I mean, the art of existence is living life to the fullest, but it's also accepting that some days are just about making it to tomorrow, the next day, to tomorrow, making it through that very moment. You know, sometimes it's just that 1 second that I have to get through that can get me to another second or moment that might have some hope. There's always hope, and yet in our darkest hour, we miss that. So TechNACITY, I've always been very vocal about my mental health. It's always been impossible for me to separate the two. Jiu-jitsu and everything I do is and mental health and sometimes mental illness. So there's always that component. So the Z team is also a throw out to Luke 13:31, a biblical parable: the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And that's just a shout out to all the people I know that suffer in silence or isolation, and they still count, they matter, and I hope everyone recognizes that there's someone in their neighborhood that might not get out as much as they need to, and sometimes just a smile or hey, how you doing, goes a long way with that person. So, and you guys know firsthand as promoters that there would be times I would call you 2 or 3 days before the promotion and say, I just can't make it. You know, there's times I'm at the promotion, I'm selling, I'm bartering, I got a hat on and whatever, 3 hats on and doing my thing. And there's other times where I cannot go and meet that public energy today.
Can't do the crowds.
Can't do the crowds. And then other days I can. So I'm fortunate for those days I can. And those days I can't, I'm fortunate to slowly begin to recognize that they pass, and life is good. I'm thankful.
So when you think about those days where, I think everybody can relate to some extent about kind of falling into that rut and dealing with the prison that can be in your own head. And it's an awful sensation, but everybody has, some of their own things they lean to, or things that help them kind of get through to the next step. Now, you mentioned jiu-jitsu as being one of those things for you. For people that are looking for advice or sensing a kindred spirit kind of thing, what are the areas you'd kind of focus on or recommend people invest their energy into or think about or focus on to kind of get to the next day?
Well, I'm a therapist, mental health and addictions predominantly, of course. So I could look at it from a number of angles, but if we looked at it from the benefits of jiu-jitsu or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, there's been days I've had to drag myself to the gym, but I leave with a little bit of a hug. And that's because any type of exercise is going to increase that flow of endorphin, the dopamines. There's the community at jiu-jitsu. There's the purpose. There's the excitement. There's the security that comes with knowing that I'm not going to be bullied anymore. I don't have to go out and look for fights, but I'm not going to be bullied. There's the tournament scene taught me a lot about what we call exposure therapy in psychology. And I did not like competing. But I believe that there's certain things in life that if we expose ourselves to, if we push through, that we can do. So competing was kind of terrifying, and yet it was also something I really wanted to do. So I held myself accountable to go to every tournament.
I think a lot of people struggle with that. that I've talked to anyways have that. They really want to try a tournament. They want to try their first tournament. They've been to a dozen. They just can't pull the trigger. That anxiety's there.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
You know, if they never go to a tournament and they simply enjoy the jiu-jitsu experience in their club with their local community, that's awesome. But nonetheless, if I've tried to if someone wants to compete and yet can't, that's the individual I want to help.
Right.
If someone deep down inside doesn't want to compete, but they think they should because others want them to, or it's normal, that's not someone I would necessarily put any additional pressure on. Of course not. There's no need for you to compete. But if you really want to do it, and it's your life goal, it's possible, because I did it. And I was never an athlete. I was horrifically out of shape when I joined. Like I said, I was a smoker, and I would watch the UFC and mock the guys who were tired. Yeah, I was like, "What's a 5-minute fight, man? What's the matter with these guys?"
Then you try it for 30 seconds.
Then I try it for 30 seconds. It's like, oh. The first day, I literally, I went home and thought, I was 26 or 27 when I started my boxing, and that was the first introduction to something formal. And I literally thought there's something seriously, permanently wrong with me. I was that physically broken, and I had an interesting coaching experience, and there was times I'd come home and cry. It would just be like, man, our coach was old school, and he wasn't about, you can do it, you can do it. He was like, you look like a bag of milk with 4 twigs sticking out of it. And I'd be trying to punch, and he'd be, and he was great, but he was old school, and I'd come home.
Question whether it's for you.
Yeah, so anyone out there that wants to do it just because they want to, if your anxiety is so high that can't get through the doors without someone else supporting you, or you think that there's a bunch of tough guys down in a basement that don't cry, that was probably, as a therapist and as a man who cries, one of my biggest secrets that I can't disclose due to ethical issues is that some of the toughest guys in the world cry. Some of these big tough MMA fighters, when you see them backstage, because I eventually went on to do a few MMA fights, which never, ever, 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 ever was an option, without the supports I had and the people that believed in me and accepted that it's going to take 7-8 years maybe before I get to the cage. But I've learned that real men cry, so I'm a real man because I cry. So, but it's been good. It's been a journey. Thank you for what you guys have provided and presented to the Atlantic Canada community that allows people to develop their skills in competition, and for a guy like me to make a living. So not quite a living, but a passion fulfilled, we'll say.
It's one of the things that we always speak about whenever we have a chance to kind of sit back and just reminisce or reflect is, how incredible the community is, how tight-knit it is, despite the fact that it's growing rapidly, like you talked about earlier. I remember the days at MXT, the old Bayside location, where a big class was, 7 guys, right? That was a big night on the mats. And, now we've had classes where 25 guys is a regular night.
Yep.
So it's, despite the explosive growth, how tight-knit and how just welcoming, and I think just in jiu-jitsu in general, you have to get acclimated to having your ego bruised. You got to get broken down before you can get built up.
Yep. It's
and,
real.
Speaking to things like the importance of mental health and the struggles and the things we all deal with to kind of get there, that's a message, one, that can't be expressed enough. So thank you for doing everything you do to bring the stigma forward and talk about it's okay to talk about these things. It's okay to be emotional. But at the same time, that community is always there to build each other up, despite the fact that it's competitive. You step on the mat, you're trying to beat your opponent, right? But at the same time, it's through that crucible, that baptism by fire. You're trying to help each other develop and grow and just learn as individuals and athletes, man. it's hard not to get excited by that.
Exactly, and it's a one-of-a-kind sport.
Yeah, it's a strange bond that you can't find anywhere else.
The hierarchy of ego is quickly maybe established. You quickly know your place, and if the pack promotes or puts the right leader in place, then the community just continues to grow the way it should. If behind every good club, there's a leader at the top of that club that
setting the example,
setting that example, and we're all so raw, we're all so vulnerable, and we make an unspoken agreement to be humbled and vulnerable amongst one another, and we all recognize that on any given day anything can happen, and it's not like other sports where you might wonder, out on the basketball court, who's there's some ego sometimes. We don't have to do that in our jiu-jitsu club. We're quite comfortable in saying that's the guy, and yet he's quite comfortable rolling with us at whatever level he is, and not saying I'm the guy. It's really unique. It's fascinating how you bring that. It's cool.
Yeah. Well, listen. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to take a few minutes, man, talk to us.
Thank you, man. Thank you guys for what you're doing, and thanks to the community.
Yeah. So anybody who's out looking, make sure you keep your eye out for the Z Team, TechNACITY, Mean Street Mission Wear. Dan is always around, big supporter for the maritime community, a big supporter.
Sponsored us since our first event, and every event since. Shout out to our other sponsors: Akiro, Pro-Am Belts,
Brick New Ground, Creative Lifestyle Studio, obviously, Naturally Fit Fredericton, Fight Supply, and we'll be back soon, guys, with another edition of Coffees and Crossfaces. So
absolutely.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.
Like and subscribe our YouTube channel.